Desert Willow, a town of secrets. Desert Willow wore its charm like a well-tailored suit. Its tree-lined streets, bustling farmers' market, and cozy, brightly lit homes seemed to promise a life free of trouble. Tourists stopped to snap photos of the quaint main street, where shopkeepers waved at passers-by, and children pedaled by on bikes, their laughter trailing in the breeze. But Desert Willow was a town that thrived on appearances. Beneath the friendly smiles and picturesque facades, secrets festered in the shadows, none darker than those concealed within Joe's Pizzeria. Joe's wasn't just a restaurant. It was the heart of the town. The smell of baked dough and melting cheese wafted out onto the street, drawing in a steady stream of customers. Families celebrated birthdays over slices of pizza. High schoolers piled in after football games, and local politicians hashed out debates over steaming plates of spaghetti. But the crown jewel of Joe's menu was the famed meatball pizza. The tiny smoky meatballs were unlike anything anyone had ever tasted. They melted in your mouth, leaving behind a burst of flavor that made every bite unforgettable. "It's the recipe," Joe would say with a sly smile when customers asked about them. "Old country secret, passed down from my family." If they pressed further, Joe would laugh and change the subject. "Don't ruin the magic," he'd say. But the truth about those meatballs was far darker than anyone could imagine. Hunter's World. Hunter Cruz didn't live on the tree-lined streets of Desert Willow. He lived in a sagging trailer on the town's outskirts, where the dirt roads were littered with broken glass and rusting cars sat on cinder blocks, waiting for repairs that would never come. His trailer leaned to one side, its once white paint now a patchwork of peeling flakes and rust. The yard, if it could even be called that, was a graveyard of beer cans, cracked tires, and discarded appliances. His father, Earl, spent most of his time in a rickety lawn chair outside, a can of cheap beer always in his hand. Earl had once been a star, the town's golden boy. People still whispered about his high school football days when he could throw a spiral 50 yards with pinpoint accuracy. But a knee injury in college had shattered that dream, and Earl had returned to Desert Willow a bitter, broken man. He rarely spoke about the past, except when he was drunk enough to rail against bad luck and the people who'd abandoned him. One of those people was a Hunter's mother, Diane. Hunter was 7 when Diane left. She was tired of the arguments, the empty beer cans, the endless promises Earl never kept. One night, she packed her bags while Earl passed out in his chair, kissed Hunter on the forehead, and whispered, "I'll come back for you, baby." He remembered watching her taillights fade into the darkness, his small hands pressed against the window. He waited for days, then weeks, but she never returned. Diane's absence left a hole in Hunter's life that nothing could fill. At school, he was Earl's boy. Kids mocked him for his too small clothes and the beer cans that littered his yard. Teachers pitied him but did little to help. Hunter learned to keep his head down and fend for himself. He scavenged meals where he could, stealing leftovers from the school cafeteria or begging stale bread from neighbors. Life was survival, and trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. A lifeline. When Joe offered Hunter a job at the pizzeria, it felt like salvation. At 16, Hunter had been desperate for a way out of the trailer park. Joe didn't just give him work, he gave him something even rarer: kindness. "You're not your old man, kid," Joe told him on his first day, clapping him on the back. "Stick with me, and you'll go places." For the first time, Hunter felt seen. Joe treated him like a son, showing him how to fold dough, toss a pizza, and handle the ovens. "It's not just about cooking," Joe would say. "It's about making people feel good." The customers adored Joe, and Hunter couldn't help but admire the way he brought people together. Joe's approval became a lifeline, a steady voice in the chaos of Hunter's life. But beneath Joe's warmth lay a darker agenda. The first crack. One evening, long after the last customer had left, Joe called Hunter into the back room. The air was cool and heavy, the hum of the freezer filling the silence. Joe leaned against the counter, his face pale and drawn. "I need to tell you something," he began, his voice raspy. "I've got cancer. Doctors say it's terminal." Hunter's stomach dropped. "Joe." "Don't start," Joe interrupted, holding up a hand. "I'm not scared of dying. What scares me is what happens after I'm gone. This place, this pizzeria, is what keeps this town together. Without it, Desert Willow would fall apart." Joe's gaze hardened. "That's why I need someone to carry it on. Someone who understands what this place means. Someone I can trust." Hunter felt a flicker of pride and fear. "I don't know if I—" "You can," Joe said firmly. "You've got it in you, kid. I'll show you everything." Frank's warning. It was late, the kind of still, heavy night where even the desert seemed to hold its breath. The last customer had left hours ago, and the pizzeria was quiet except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the rhythmic swish of Joe mopping the floor. Hunter was cleaning the counter when the front door burst open, the bell jangling violently. He turned, startled, to see Frank, a wiry drifter with sunken eyes and a ragged beard, staggering inside. Frank looked wild, his clothes stained with sweat and dust. His trembling hands clutched something wrapped in a filthy cloth. "Joe!" he bellowed, his voice raw with fury. "You bastard!" Hunter froze as Frank approached the counter. With a dramatic sweep, Frank unfurled the cloth and slammed its contents onto the polished wood. Hunter's stomach lurched. It was an arm, pale, discolored, and unmistakably human. "You're putting people in those meatballs," Frank screamed, his voice cracking. "You're feeding this town people." Joe didn't flinch. He leaned on the mop handle, his expression unreadable. "Frank," he said evenly, "you've been drinking again. Why don't you sleep it off?" Frank's face twisted with rage. "Don't you dare! I've seen the bags you haul out of here at night. I've seen the blood. You think you can fool everyone, but I know what you're doing." Joe sighed, setting the mop aside. His movements were slower than they used to be, and Hunter noticed the sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Joe had been coughing more lately, his face growing thinner, his skin paler. Tonight, he looked worse than ever. "Frank," Joe said, his voice calm but tired, "I don't have time for this. I've got cancer, stage 4. It's all over me, lungs, liver, bones. I'm dying." The words hit Hunter like a punch to the chest. He stared at Joe, stunned. Frank hesitated, confusion flickering across his face. Joe continued, his tone sharpening. "You think I'm wasting what time I've got left on what? Making people into meatballs? Get out of here before I call the cops." Frank's moment of doubt vanished, replaced by fury. "You think that makes you a saint?" He spat, pulling a knife from his pocket. "Cancer doesn't make you innocent. You're a monster, Joe, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." Frank lunged. The blade gleamed under the flickering fluorescent lights. Hunter didn't think. He reacted. He tackled Frank, and the two crashed into a table. The knife flashed again, and suddenly Frank gasped, his body stiffening. Blood seeped through his shirt as the knife slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor. Hunter scrambled back, his chest heaving. Frank collapsed, his breath rattling in his throat before fading into silence. Above them, the banner on the wall swayed in the breeze of the ceiling fan. Desert Willow, the last good town in California. Joe approached slowly, his steps uneven. He crouched beside Frank's lifeless body, his expression blank. "Well," he said after a long pause, "that's a mess." Hunter stared at him, his hands trembling. "Joe, he's dead. I didn't mean to." Joe cut him off, his voice firm. "You saved my life, kid. That's what matters." "But..." Hunter's eyes darted to the arm still lying on the counter. He was telling the truth, wasn't he? Joe sighed, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "Let's clean this up," he said, his voice low. "Then we'll talk." Hunter's stomach churned, but he nodded, unable to refuse the man who had given him so much. Together, they dragged Frank's body into the back room, the air heavy with unspoken truths. The freezer's truth. The next night, the pizzeria was unusually quiet. Hunter sat at one of the tables, his elbows resting on his knees, staring at the mop bucket in the corner. Frank's words echoed in his mind, louder and sharper with every passing second. "You're putting people in those meatballs." Joe's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Come on," he said, leaning heavily against the doorway to the back room. "We need to talk." Hunter followed him, his chest tight. The hum of the freezer filled the small space, and the air was colder than he expected. Joe reached into his pocket, pulling out a worn key. His hands trembled slightly as he unlocked the freezer, but his movements were steady enough to remind Hunter of the man who had built this place, the man he admired. The heavy door creaked open, and a blast of icy air hit Hunter's face. Inside, beneath a neat row of butcher paper-wrapped packages, lay what Hunter had dreaded most: bodies. Limbs, torsos, and faces stared blankly back at him, their pale skin almost glowing in the sterile light. Hunter stumbled back, his stomach twisting violently. What the hell is this?" Joe closed the door with a heavy thud, leaning against it for a moment as if the act had sapped the last of his energy. He turned to Hunter, his eyes tired but sharp. "This," he said, his voice measured, "is what makes the meatballs special." Hunter's heart pounded in his chest, and the room seemed to tilt. You're killing people?" Joe shook his head. "No, I'm not a murderer, Hunter. These people, they're drifters, junkies, the kind of folks no one's looking for. You know how this town is. Desert Willow doesn't have room for that kind of trash. I'm cleaning up what no one else will." Hunter's hands trembled. "But you're feeding them to people." Joe's expression hardened. "And what do you think people are eating when they come here, huh? They're eating the best damn meatballs they've ever had. They're eating happiness, comfort, tradition. They're eating survival, Hunter. That's what this place is about." The words hit Hunter like a slap, but Joe wasn't done. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I dreamed of this when I started out? No, but I'm dying, Hunter. I've got months, maybe weeks, left. And when I go, someone has to keep this place going. Someone who understands what it takes to keep this town alive." Hunter's breath caught. "Joe, I don't know if I can..." "You don't have a choice," Joe cut in sharply. "Frank's dead because of you. You're in this now, whether you like it or not." The room spun, the walls closing in as the weight of Joe's words settled on Hunter's shoulders. Joe stepped back, his face softening. "I'm not saying this to hurt you, kid. I'm saying it because I believe in you. You're not your father. You've got the guts to do what needs to be done. Hunter said nothing. His gaze locked on the freezer door. The hum of the motor seemed louder now, like a heartbeat pounding in his ears. Joe patted his shoulder. "Get some sleep," he said. "We've got a big delivery tomorrow." A line crossed. The days after Frank's death passed in a haze for Hunter. The freezer door loomed in his mind like a monument to the line he had already crossed. He couldn't eat. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Frank's lifeless body, the pale arm on the counter, and the freezer's grotesque contents. He kept telling himself to walk away, but Joe's words were an anchor around his neck. "Frank's dead because of you. You're in this now." Joe wasn't doing much better. The cancer was eating away at him faster now. His face was gaunt, his steps slower, and his voice rasped with effort. But he pushed on, still coming in every day to oversee the kitchen, still answering customer questions about the meatballs with a smile. To anyone else, Joe seemed like the same beloved figure he had always been. Only Hunter could see the cracks forming beneath his fatherly facade. One evening, just before closing, Joe called Hunter into the back room. He was sitting on a stool, his shoulders slumped, his breath labored. He looked older than ever, as if the years had caught up to him all at once. "I can't keep doing this," Joe said, his voice barely above a whisper. He gestured weakly toward the freezer. "It's time for you to step up." Hunter felt the room tilt again, the air too thick to breathe. "What are you talking about?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Joe pulled a knife from the counter beside him and held it out, the blade gleaming under the fluorescent light. "There's a man in the storeroom," he said. "A drifter. Been hanging around the alley for weeks. Nobody's gonna miss him." Hunter stared at the knife as if it were a snake poised to strike. "Joe, I can't do this." "You can," Joe said firmly. "And you will." He coughed, his entire body shaking from the effort. When he finally caught his breath, he fixed Hunter with a hard stare. "This isn't just about the meatballs. It's about the town. People come here for comfort, for happiness. What we're doing, it's ugly, I know that. But it's what this place needs. It's what Desert Willow needs." Hunter shook his head, tears stinging his eyes. "There has to be another way. This can't be the only way." Joe's expression softened for a moment, but the steel in his voice didn't waver. "I thought that once, too. But there's no room for sentimentality in this world, Hunter. Not if you want to survive." The weight of the knife in Hunter's hand was heavier than he could have imagined. It felt like all the guilt, all the fear, all the anger he had ever known condensed into cold steel. His legs felt like lead as he walked toward the storeroom, each step echoing in his ears. The drifter was sitting on the floor, his hands bound, a gag over his mouth. His eyes darted up to Hunter, wide with terror, and for a moment Hunter froze. He thought of Frank, of the freezer, of the life he had wanted to build for himself, outside of his father's shadow. But then Joe's voice came back to him, steady and unrelenting. "You're not your father. You've got the guts to do what needs to be done." With trembling hands, Hunter raised the knife. The drifter thrashed against his bindings, his muffled cries filling the room. Hunter squeezed his eyes shut, his breath hitching as the blade came down. When it was over, Hunter staggered back, the knife slipping from his hands and clattering to the floor. He couldn't bring himself to look at the body. His chest heaved, and the walls seemed to close in around him. Joe appeared in the doorway, his face pale but resolute. "Good," he said quietly. "You did good." Hunter turned to him, his voice hollow. "I don't feel anything." Joe's gaze softened, and for a moment, He almost looked proud. That's how you know you're ready. The reckoning. The air in the pizzeria felt heavier these days, as if the walls themselves were sagging under the weight of Hunter's secrets. Joe was gone now, his passing marked by a brief but crowded funeral at the town church. People spoke in hushed tones about how much they'd miss him, about how his meatball pizza had brought joy to so many lives. Hunter stood at the back, numb, as he listened to their words. None of them knew what Joe had left behind, or what he had left Hunter to carry. Hunter hadn't always felt this way. For a long time, he had fought against the pull of the darkness Joe had drawn him into. But after Frank's death, and the weight of his first kill, something inside him had begun to shift. He started to accept the nightmare, telling himself it was his role now, his destiny. Joe had convinced him that the town needed this, that without the pizzeria, Desert Willow would fall apart. Hunter didn't just believe it. He was starting to believe it was all he was good for. Then Sarah walked into his life. It was a few months before Joe passed. Hunter had been standing outside the pizzeria, taking out the trash when she approached, struggling with a flat tire on her old sedan. She was new to town, and the moment she looked at him with a mix of exasperation and hope, Hunter felt a crack in the walls he'd built around himself. "Hi," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Do you know where I can get help with this? I think my spare's flat, too." Hunter hesitated, feeling awkward and unsure of himself. I've got a jack and a compressor inside. I could try to help?" "Really? That'd be amazing," she said, smiling in a way that lit her whole face. As he worked on her car, she stayed by his side, chatting about how she'd just moved to Desert Willow to teach at the elementary school. Her voice was warm, full of enthusiasm, and she spoke about the town like it was a place of promise instead of the prison Hunter saw. For the first time in years, he felt seen. Not as Earl's son or Joe's apprentice, but as himself. When the tire was fixed, she had reached out and clasped his hand in gratitude. "Thank you, Hunter. You're a lifesaver." Her touch lingered in his mind for days afterward, like a small light in the unrelenting darkness. She started coming to the pizzeria after that, always ordering a soda and a slice of cheese pizza, even though everyone raved about the meatballs. "I'm vegetarian," she'd said once with a laugh, and Hunter had felt a strange relief he couldn't explain. Her presence became a lifeline. Every time she walked through the door, he found himself clinging to her laughter, her kindness, the way she looked at him like he was someone who mattered. She began to represent something he hadn't dared dream of, a life outside the shadow of Joe's legacy.